is Sunrise Sunset, and I'm Audrey Gordon. We talk about the Jewish families in transition. My guest today is Joanne Koch. She is a playwright, an author, an award-winning journalist, and she and her husband co-authored a syndicated column called Family Live. And Joanne and I are going to talk today about men and women's roles and sexuality, two very hot topics. Hi.
Hi.
Let's start with sexuality. I think a lot of television starts with that today, so maybe we ought to do that too. What kinds of things, I know that you wrote a book about marriage and sex therapists, and that you've done a lot of interviewing of teenage girls with regard to their sexual practices. What kinds of things are you seeing with teenage girls and even teenage boys with sexuality today?
Well, what we're seeing is a lot more sexual activity at an earlier age. And we're also seeing a very big gap between sex education and availability of birth control and sexual activity. Young girls that I've talked to have mentioned the fact that they haven't gotten the sex education they needed soon enough. Very often, the whole program about adolescence is geared to male adolescents who go through puberty at a later age. And now we have girls who are beginning puberty at 12 and also at 11 and 10. And they need to have this information, and they don't want to wait until they're in high school to find out everything they should know. So we get too little, too late. The other thing we don't get is we don't get families talking about sex. After that initial talk that you give to perhaps your 5-year-old,
paper wrappered book or whatever.
Right, and we feel very progressive because unlike our parents or grandparents, we in fact are telling our 5-year-olds about the differences in anatomy and how babies are born, and we feel very good about that, and we never say another word about it. And in fact, that happens in the majority of American families. That one little talk is given. Men completely stop talking about it. They don't talk to their sons about it, and they don't talk to their daughters about it. Women talk about some areas of sexuality with their daughters primarily. But when it comes to the basic issue of sexual activity, the possibility of pregnancy, birth control, what forms, where can it be gotten, what are the dangers of each method, these things are not discussed for the most part.
Do you think that some parents think that if they talk about it that they might be condoning it?
Yes. I think it's a very common fear. But my feeling about it is this. First of all, we have nothing to indicate that talking about sexuality causes more sexual activity. And we do know that ignorance does cause kids not to use birth control, not to find out about it, and eventually to become pregnant. So if you look at the two things and you say, well, maybe there is the very slightest danger that my child has never thought about these things, and suddenly I am going to plant this idea. And on the other hand is this tremendous risk and danger of sexual activity without birth control, of teenage pregnancy. I think the choice is pretty obvious, really.
Well, isn't it blind of a parent to think that in this particular culture, with the kind of media splash that they make about sexuality, I'm talking about print journalism as well as television, with the emphasis on billboards with sexual innuendos and teenage porno films, sex is all around them. Isn't it blind for them to think that their kids are not thinking about it?
I think that the media hype on sex is a very misleading thing. I think a lot of parents feel their children have information because they talk in a very sophisticated manner.
Having picked that up.
They pick up the terminology of sexual activity, and they give an illusion of sophistication and knowledge, almost to the point where I think some parents think their children really know. Well,
maybe
they really
more
know.
than they do.
Maybe more than they do. But the fact is that they don't know the things that are going to make a difference for them. They may know that Brooke Shields can say something about her Calvin Kleins that has a double meaning. And they may recognize that fact. But when it comes to the time when they are alone in a car with a guy, they are not going to have birth control. That's what I'm talking about. They have the veneer and this outward gift, if you want to call it a gift, of talking about sexuality and seeming to be at ease with it. But when it comes right down to it, they have the same problem that their parents may have had, except their parents had that issue much later on
in their lives.
Right.
Well, in other words, what you're saying is that when we take adolescents, boys and girls as well, and we dress them up in ways that they become miniature adults, much in the way that they did centuries ago, we almost ascribe to them the same kind of adult sophistication because the package looks as sophisticated, but they don't have it. Inside they're still really kids.
The need for some kind of guidance and some kind of support is still there. And the reason I think it's important to talk about sex in your own home is that the sex education, such as it is, that children will get, by the very nature of our public school system, is going to be value-free. It's a kind of a misleading term, but it means that anybody who's teaching sex education is taught that they are not to teach certain values.
What's
they are
right,
just to
what's
teach
wrong,
what happens.
The
they
mechanics.
are clearly guided away. So they teach, in a sense, the plumbing. And they will try to help kids in terms of talking about relationships, but they have to be very careful. We, as parents, have the opportunity to talk to our children about this and to pass along our own personal values. There is no reason why a parent can't tell, if a parent feels, and I'm sure many parents do, that no matter what kind of birth control their daughter may use, that they would still prefer that girl not be sexually active in high school. If that's their feeling, there's nothing wrong in saying this. It's just that they should not go under the illusion that if they say this, that automatically means their daughter will follow suit. Right. But I think they should express their values and their feelings about it, recognizing that the option may still, another option may still be chosen.
Do you think that kids sometimes have a pregnancy or an abortion so secretive that because they don't know how their parents will feel, or that their parents could not endorse their sexual behavior in such a way that they could even confide in them that this has happened?
Oh, I think this happens all the time, and it's very sad. I've interviewed teenage girls of 15 and 16 who have gone until their 5th month of pregnancy, first denying to themselves that they were pregnant. I mean, I've seen them come up with the most unbelievable excuses. I've gained weight, and maybe I have a tumor, maybe there's a cyst there. I mean, unbelievable stuff. But then they deny it to they are desperately afraid of telling their parents. They have the idea that their parents would condemn them for being sexually active, that they would think of them as bad girls, whatever thoughts they may have, even if the parent has never said anything like this. Very often they have. And they consequently hold off letting the parent know. And sometimes they will avoid going to a clinic where they could at least get counseling as to whether or not they should go ahead and have this child. They hold off doing that because it would involve telling their mothers. And I say telling their mothers because I think mother comes in here very strongly.
Well, I've known several families where the girls have had abortions after telling the mothers, but the father doesn't know.
Well, there are, as I said,
different permutations.
It's very commonly the case that there is no discussion with father about sexuality. So they may not want to tell their father, but I think with mothers there is a little bit of a bridge that's been built. And what I would suggest is that bridge be widened so that more can be discussed. So it's not just a question of menstruation, and it's not just a question of birth and pregnancy, which most mothers feel comfortable discussing with their daughters, but that it is talking about sexuality.
would you say that maybe some mothers then, given that kind of obligation, need to think more about their own lives and their own sexuality, and that perhaps for some people those discussions are very troubling because they're not quite sure at their particular developmental stage in their lives, in their late 30s, in their early 40s, that they have it all together.
Right. None of us have it all together.
We like to think we do sometimes.
I think that
we don't.
Women who were brought up in, say, the 50s, the early 60s, and prior to that, didn't have the opportunity to air these feelings. Mm-hmm. They were not encouraged to talk about sexuality at all, even with other women. Admitting you were sexually active and talking about it was not encouraged. So women who are mothers then have a difficult time feeling comfortable with this.
Right.
And it may be that it would be helpful to have an opportunity to talk to your peers about it, to talk in a setting where there are other adults, other mothers talking about this
perhaps
issue.
with someone who could lead it, or
right, as a kind of preliminary,
yeah.
because you can't expect to feel comfortable about it if you've never discussed it even with your own peers and with your own mother.
I think sometimes it isn't that women don't want to talk to these things about with their daughters. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to say it because they've never articulated it to anyone.
Right.
And certainly when you're a parent, you don't want to appear to be not in command of what it is you're doing with the child.
It might be an added incentive to parents if they would think about what it would mean if their daughters became pregnant. I think you just have to face that and what the consequences of that would be, because that's really the bottom line here. And
the other thing you're saying is that possibility increases.
That possibility is very strong right now because over 50% of the women 19 and under are sexually active. And the big turning point for teenagers is the age of 16. So that a great number of girls become sexually active at 16, even though it's not the majority. A great number do. And the opportunities are there. There are cars. Men and women are away from the house. And a lot of sexual activity just takes place at home. Nobody's there. There's no real supervision. What happens to a teenage girl if she becomes pregnant? And majority of teenage girls who become pregnant keep their children.
They do.
They do. All right? And that's something else to keep in mind. And we're living in a society where they have the legal right to keep that child. In other words, I can envision a situation where a girl becomes pregnant and the parents, recognizing that this may ruin her future and so forth, insist that she have an abortion. And the girl says, no, I want to have this baby. Now, it may be for all kinds of reasons that the parents consider immature and unfortunate and unrealistic, but she has the legal right to go ahead and have that child.
Curious question, does the parent have the legal right to support that child?
That can be the parent's choice as to whether that child, whether their daughter and that child then go on welfare or what have you. But what I'm saying is that the person has the right. But for most parents, that's not the issue either, because it wouldn't be that kind of question where they're ready to go to court. We've got to recognize that a teenage girl who becomes pregnant has, number one, she is likely to want to keep the child. That's certainly a possibility. Number two, her chances, her entire future is then skewed. Her chances of going and getting higher education are reduced greatly. Her chances of being poor increase greatly. There was a study done in the Woodlawn community of Chicago, and it was found that no matter what somebody's choice was concerning marriage, the choice to have a child, or maybe it wasn't a matter of choice initially, but having a child as a teenager was the biggest factor determining that person's future, their economic and social
Whether
future.
they were married or not.
The single factor. Leave aside marriage, because what is a marriage for two teenagers? What is a marriage between two 16-year-olds? The guy, and I interviewed one couple not too long ago, and this really was a heartbreaker, because you had two terrific kids. The girl became pregnant, again, lack of information about birth control, a great deal of ignorance on both sides. And then the kid dropped out of high school and started seeking a job, wound up with a part-time job. At the time I interviewed them, had been fired. Now, chances are the marriage is not going to last. But having a marriage under those circumstances really doesn't help anyone. In fact, in some ways it's worse because it is a detriment to both people. He loses out on his education. She doesn't get her education, and both of them are kind of sinking together.
What are some of the reasons why teenage girls might want to keep babies, and what happens to them when the realization sets in?
Okay. What do teenagers know about being parents? Not too many of them have had, they have done some babysitting. What happens when a teenager goes babysitting? Very often the child is asleep, ready to go to bed. There are very few opportunities they have to be with a child continually and be responsible for a child. They have no idea of how demanding another dependent human being can be. No conception of this. So for many teenage girls, after all, when you're an adolescent, you want to be loved. Right. Being loved is very important. And it may be the thing that got them in trouble in the first place, because so many girls that I interviewed, why did you go ahead and have sex with this guy? You knew that you weren't taking any precautions. Well, I felt so good, and I felt that I really loved him, and it would be a sign of my love. And you can't imagine how that comes up as an excuse. All right, so here is a human being who is looking for love very desperately. And here is the possibility of this lovely little creature that's kind of like a teddy bear, and it's cuddly, soft, and it's going to love me. So many girls will say, well, my baby's going to love me.
They're going to be
more
the
than my parents did, more than anyone.
Right.
I will be the love object.
Right.
And it's totally, as we know, as parents, it is totally confused and turned upside down. And then when they find out, there's this terrible dawning that baby keeps crying, and that baby is not doing anything for me. I have to do for it continually, and I can't go out, and I can't have a break. And besides, I can't afford babysitters, and on and on. So that by the time those teenage parents, by the time their children are about 2 years old, that's when you begin to see neglect of the infant.
Abuse.
You begin to see abuse at that time. And it's because they have very little support to be parents. They know very little about being parents.
Do you think that there's a romantic myth in our society about what love, sexuality, intercourse is all about, and that makes teenagers more reluctant to use or prepare for birth control methods, that it takes some of the romanticism away?
Well, I think there's no question that that teenage girls, especially young teenage girls, like to have an idea of themselves when it comes to sexuality as being swept away. As being carried away on a wonderful wave of love and warmth and passion and so forth.
Like the books.
Like
and
the
books.
Movies. And the books and the movies haven't changed all that much, because how many movies do we see, even the contemporary explicit movies where teenagers are sexually active, how many times do you see a girl stop and say, wait a minute, do you have a condom? I don't have a diaphragm. I mean, who has ever seen that?
Right.
There was a series called James at 16 that was on television for some time. And I remember a very big controversy. In that series, James was going to have an affair with a woman, and there was a big question as to whether this should be shown. But then when it's finally shown, is anything said about birth control? No, of course not. And so what I'm saying is that these myths are perpetuated. Even when sexual activity is seen rather blatantly, there's nothing about what can happen afterwards. There's very little.
We were talking earlier about the movie Fame, when you had taken your teenage daughter to see the movie.
Right. Well, Fame is a perfect example. I mean, I enjoyed the movie. I'm not putting it down in any way, but here you had a movie about a high school, following these high school kids. And you have a number of episodes in there that relate to sexuality. One girl winds up getting an abortion. You have another girl who is in love with a guy, and you see them, and they, in a sense, they go off into the sunset, just the way they used to in the 50s, except it's very clear. There is no question about what they're doing after they go off. I mean, at least before there might have been some doubt, especially with teenagers, but it's very clear, and yet nothing is said. There's no indication. And I have a friend who's a psychiatrist, and she wanted to start a campaign to have teenage girls carry condoms. Teenage girls who were saying, I said, Anne, this is ridiculous. You will never, that will never happen. It is, it goes against the grain of a girl. Even I can see young women feeling very uncomfortable with that.
Well, not only that, they would, what the men would think of them. What the men, I mean, this is a girl who walks around prepared. You know, it's like
it's a statement that I am
having,
sexually active.
Right,
Even if you are sexually active, you're not supposed to be upfront about it. You're not supposed to make that statement.
And girls especially are not supposed to be assertive about that.
Right, and that's a real double bind for girls, because they're not supposed to be assertive about the fact, even now, even today, and yet they are sexually active, and that puts them in a very dangerous situation. And I'm really very concerned about it, and I wish the media would do a little bit more, not just by way of the program, which says, now we will talk very seriously about sex education, but some of the films and some of the stories about teenagers, I think, have to show something about this, have to really deal with that dilemma.
In other words, if we were to redo the TV show you were talking about, then James at 16 would also say something about, let me go get my condom.
Well, something, I mean, it doesn't have to be, it can be handled in a way that is discreet, that is graceful, and yet it can be handled, because it's a real issue. You know, some efforts have been made. What is the man's role in all of this? What is the role of the teenage guy in all of this?
Right.
Because, and efforts have been made to make teenage guys more responsible about this, to make them realize that you may have seen the poster of a teenage guy with a big stomach and trying to make them think, how does this feel? But I can tell you so far that it hasn't made an enormous difference. One girl that I interviewed who had a baby said, we talked about what had happened to the guy at the time of the birthday. She said, well, I called him up, but he had a date. I called him up that night, but he had a date. And I'm sorry, but that's a reality in high school. The commitment is not that likely to be there. And this is not a put down of teenage guys in any way. But the fact is that it becomes the girl's problem, and it is the girl's problem. I think we should keep educating everybody as much as we possibly can, but I think young girls have to realize that
they're left with the consequences, quite literally.
And very often their families are left with the consequences too.
Do you think that teenage girls have other kinds of binds perhaps on them now?
Oh, a lot of pressures. There are enormous pressures on girls. You know, I was certainly one of the people who heralded and welcomed the equality and the great widening of opportunities for women, absolutely, and I'm not pulling away from that position. But there are pressures that go along with it, and never before have I understood exactly what men, not exactly what men went through, but somewhat of men went through. Never did I understand it until I started working full-time. What's happening with girls now is the pressures to find a career are as intense as they are for men. The pressure to get into the right school, intense as they are for men. I heard a conversation, it happened to be amongst some Jewish women the other day, and it was very funny to me, because one woman was saying, oh, my daughter is starting Amherst this year, and the other woman was saying, oh, really? Mine was just accepted to Yale. And it was one of these old kinds of conversations, all the my son, the doctor, and so forth, all of those jokes that we've heard. But really, it's happening. And amongst Jewish families and amongst other families, but Jewish families have always been very, as we know, very much oriented to achievement and academic excellence, education, and so forth, so the pressure is on.
But then Jewish women have also been acclimated, in addition to achievement, to producing families and taking care of families. So
Right.
that's why there's a double pressure.
Right, right. And what happens is that I don't think it's any coincidence that some of the leaders of the women's movement, some of the prominent leaders were Jewish women.
Right.
I think, in fact, that it had to be. Because what happened in America in the 40s and 50s is Jewish families began to raise their girls and their boys pretty much the same. They both, there was a secularization, there was a falling away from orthodoxy. Both boys and girls were raised to go to school, to achieve, and then all of a sudden, you'd graduate college or you'd come pretty close to it, and suddenly marriage, great hustle around, run and find a husband, you must find a husband, settle down. But all of that training, all of that tracking to find a goal, to be excellent in school, and all of that had already taken its effect. So there we had Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique and the whole thing. We were brought up to learn. We were brought up to do in the outside world. Then suddenly you can't anymore. When Lou and I began to write the column, which is called Family Lib, by the way.
Family Lib.
L-I-B.
Okay.
Right. It was really about a family trying to accommodate to the changes in sex roles. That's how the column got started. And we were talking about things that we were going through because we had both been brought up in traditional families, and yet we both I wanted to do things other than raising children.
Not
how could
to
that
the
be?
exclusion.
Definitely not to the exclusion.
I know you haven't, so that's I wanted to make clear.
Definitely not to the exclusion of. And I think women continue to care deeply about their families. And every study I have seen about contemporary women now, women still feel, young women with young children still feel it's more their responsibility to find the proper setting for their children, to be around for their children. They still feel more of the load of responsibility than the men do. So that hasn't changed all that much. But the pressure to have a career, the pressure to get out there and prove yourself in the outside world is there as it has never been before.
I agree with you, and I'd really like to have you come back and maybe talk more about, women and men and the kinds of roles that they're playing today and the pressures that they have. My guest today has been Joanne Koch, playwright, co-author with her husband Lou of a book called The Marriage Savers, collaborator of a new book, Pathways of Child Development, that will be out with Wiley & Sons. And she and I have been talking about sexuality, teenage roles, and the sorts of pressures that are on young girls today. This is Audrey Gordon, Sunrise Sunset, and thank you very much.